The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and Eleanor Voss read it exactly once before she folded it into the smallest square she could manage and pressed it to the bottom of her traveling trunk beneath her good wool dress and her mother's Bible. It was not a kind letter. It was not even a polite one. It was a letter from a man named Caleb Harding of Dusty Creek, Texas, a man Eleanor had never met, had never corresponded with, and had never in her 23 years of living ever agreed to marry. Yet somehow, through a chain of events so tangled and humiliating that she could barely reconstruct it without her face burning red, she had been promised to him. Her Aunt Margaret was responsible. Of course it was Aunt Margaret. Eleanor's mother had died 3 years prior, leaving Eleanor and her younger sister Rose in the care of their father, a mild-mannered schoolteacher in Abilene, Kansas, who loved his daughters deeply, but had no particular talent for the practical management of their futures. Aunt Margaret, her mother's older sister, had stepped into that practical vacuum with tremendous enthusiasm and very little restraint. She had written to an agency in Fort Worth, one of those respectable marriage broker establishments that matched Western men of means with Eastern or Kansan women of good character, and she had submitted Eleanor's name without asking Eleanor so much as a single question about the matter. The letter from Caleb Harding arrived 6 weeks later. He had apparently been given Eleanor's name, her age, her father's profession, a description of her physical appearance that Margaret had penned herself: tall, auburn hair, good teeth, strong constitution, and had decided on the basis of this information that he would like to marry her by the following June. Eleanor found out about all of this when Aunt Margaret presented her with the letter over a Sunday dinner, beaming as though she had just produced a roasted turkey from thin air. "He owns property," Margaret had said, "over 400 acres outside Dusty Creek. He runs cattle. He is 30 years old and widowed, no children, and the agency says he is a man of steady temperament and good Christian character." Eleanor had put her fork down very carefully so she would not do something regrettable with it. "You wrote to a marriage broker," she said, "using my name. Someone had to take action, Eleanor. You are 23. Your prospects in Abilene are mine to manage," Eleanor said. "They are mine to manage, Aunt Margaret. But the damage, as they say in such situations, was already done. Caleb Harding had written. The agency had sent him Eleanor's information. He was, according to Margaret's inquiries, a real man with a real ranch and real expectations, and someone was going to have to explain to him that there had been a terrible mistake. Eleanor decided she would do it herself. This decision was, she later acknowledged, both impractical and completely understandable. She could have written a letter. She probably should have written a letter. A clean, polite letter explaining the misunderstanding would have been the sensible course of action. But Eleanor Voss had spent her entire life being sensible in ways that benefited other people, and she found that, on this particular occasion, she did not want to be sensible. She wanted to travel 300 miles south to Dusty Creek, Texas, stand in front of this Caleb Harding person, and explain to his face that she was not a heifer to be arranged for by her aunt, that she was a woman with her own mind and her own future, and that she wished him well in finding someone who had actually agreed to find him. She purchased her train ticket the following Monday. Her father tried to talk her out of it over breakfast, not because he thought her wrong, he privately thought she was entirely right, but because he was a worrier by nature and the idea of his eldest daughter traveling alone across the Kansas-Texas line made him grip his coffee cup too hard. "Write him a letter," he said. "I am going in person," Eleanor said. "At least let me come with you. You have school, and you are terrible in confrontations. You would apologize to him before I'd even opened my mouth. He couldn't argue with that." He gave her money from the box under his bed instead, enough for the train fare and 2 weeks in a boarding house, pressed her hands, told her to be careful, and stood on the porch watching her wagon until it disappeared around the bend in the road. Eleanor took the train from Abilene south through the Oklahoma Territory and into Texas, A journey of 2 days that involved a great deal of coal smoke, a woman from Missouri who wanted to talk about her brother-in-law's cattle disease, and a spectacular thunderstorm somewhere around the Red River that turned the window glass into a sheet of moving silver. Eleanor watched the land change through that silver window, the flat Kansas prairie giving way to the rolling red-earth Texas terrain, scrub oak and mesquite and endless bleached sky, and she felt something she hadn't expected, which was a mild, reluctant thrill. She had never been to Texas. She had never been anywhere, really. Abilene was where she had been born, where she had grown up, where she had taught reading and arithmetic to children at her father's school for the past 3 years since her mother's death. She was capable and steady and well-liked, and she had occasionally, in the quiet part of the night, wondered if there was something else she was supposed to be doing. Something bigger, something that didn't fit inside the 4 walls of a schoolroom in Abilene, Kansas. The train pulled into the Dusty Creek station at noon on a Wednesday in early May, and Eleanor descended the steps with her traveling trunk, her good wool dress packed inside it and her everyday blue dress on her back, and she stood on the platform and looked at the town spread out before her. Dusty Creek was smaller than she'd expected. Main Street ran maybe 4 blocks, with a general store, a saloon, a post office, a feed and grain, a small church with peeling white paint, a livery stable, and a collection of wooden buildings that served various unclear purposes. The streets were unpaved and currently functioning as a series of mud channels courtesy of the previous night's rain. A pair of horses stood at the saloon hitching post, looking philosophically at the mud. A dog of no identifiable breed crossed the street at an angle and disappeared behind the general store. "You need help with that trunk, miss," said a boy of about 12, appearing at her elbow. "I need directions," Eleanor said. "Is there a boarding house in town?" "Mrs. Purdue's on the north end of 2nd Street. She's got clean rooms and she charges fair." "Thank you. And do you know a man named Caleb Harding? He has a ranch somewhere outside of town." The boy's expression did something complicated. "Everybody knows Mr. Harding," he said. "He comes in on Fridays mostly. You could ask at the livery. His man Paco comes in for supplies. He'd know his business." Eleanor thanked the boy, gave him a dime for his trouble, and hauled her trunk toward Mrs. Purdue's boarding house. The boarding house was exactly what a good boarding house in a small Texas cattle town should have been. Clean floors, firm beds, windows that let in actual light, and a landlady who asked only the minimum number of personal questions required to establish that you were respectable. Mrs. Purdue was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and the kind of calm that suggested she had seen enough of life's surprises to be thoroughly unshocked by new ones. "You're not from here," she observed, setting Eleanor's room key on the counter. "Abilene," Eleanor said. "Kansas. Long way, business or family?" Eleanor considered the word for her situation. "Business," she said finally. Mrs. Purdue nodded as if this were entirely ordinary, and led her to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the back garden, where someone had planted tomatoes with considerable ambition. Eleanor unpacked only what she needed for one night, because she intended to be done with her business and on the returning train by Thursday. She was wrong about this, though she didn't know it yet. Wednesday afternoon, she walked to the livery and asked about Caleb Harding's ranch. The man at the livery, a sun-dark Mexican man named Erasmo who managed the stable with quiet efficiency, told her that the Harding Ranch, the Broken H, people called it, was about 6 miles east of town on the main road, and that if she needed to get there, he could rent her a horse or put her on the mail wagon that went out that way Thursday mornings. "I'll take the horse," Eleanor said. Erasmo looked at her with the expression of a man assessing whether she could actually ride. She stared back with the expression of a woman who had been riding since she was 7 and did not need to prove it but was perfectly willing to. "I'll have the bay mare ready in the morning," he said. She ate supper at the boarding house that night, a good plain meal of salt pork and cornbread and boiled greens, seated at a long table with 3 other guests. A traveling salesman from Dallas named Mr. Fletcher, who talked too much about the railroad. A quiet older woman named Mrs. Alcott, who was visiting her son. And a young man who gave his name as Thomas and ate very fast and said very little. Eleanor listened to Mr. Fletcher's railroad opinions, finished her cornbread, and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, which was white-painted wood with a water stain in the corner shaped vaguely like a boot. She tried to organize her thoughts about tomorrow. She would ride to the ranch. She would find Caleb Harding. She would explain, politely but with absolute clarity, that she had not agreed to this arrangement, that her aunt had acted without her knowledge or consent, that she wished him no ill, and that she was returning to Abilene. She had rehearsed this speech on the train until she had every word of it locked down tight. She told herself she was not nervous. She was a little nervous. Not about the confrontation. She was quite good at confrontations when she needed to be, and she had a solid moral footing here, but about something she couldn't quite name. Some vague anticipation that she kept pushing away whenever it crept up on her, probably because it felt too much like the thing that Aunt Margaret had been trying to manufacture for her, and Eleanor refused, on principle, to feel anything that her aunt had predicted she would feel. She fell asleep eventually, to the sound of a warm Texas wind working at the shutters. Thursday morning was bright and clean, the previous day's mud drying fast in the sun. Erasmo had the bay mare ready at 7, a sensible, smooth-gaited animal with dark eyes and a good temperament, and Eleanor set out east on the main road with her spine straight and her heart carefully composed. The road to the Broken H ran through country that was beautiful in a way she hadn't allowed herself to expect. The morning light came in low and golden over the hills, turning the silver-green scrub into something that looked almost painted. She could hear meadowlarks in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, the low sound of cattle. The air smelled of cedar and red earth, and something sweetly floral she couldn't identify, and Eleanor caught herself breathing it in more deeply than was strictly necessary. She found the ranch entrance marked by a gate made of rough cedar posts with the burned letter H and what had once been a complete horseshoe shape above the name, though 2 of the nails had come loose and one end of the shoe hung down at an angle. She noted this detail without knowing why, then rode up the lane toward the house. The Broken H was not what she had imagined, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had imagined. It was a working ranch, clearly and actively working. She could see the corrals off to the left with a dozen horses, and a long, low barn beyond that, and further back what appeared to be a bunkhouse. The main house itself was larger than the town buildings had suggested the ranch's owner might afford. A 2-story frame house with a covered porch running its full width, freshly whitewashed, with shutters painted a faded green. Someone had put window boxes on the upstairs windows, though they were empty now, and there was a rocking chair on the porch and a pair of boots by the door, and a yellow dog asleep on the top step who opened one eye as she rode up and decided she was not worth the energy of barking at. She dismounted at the gate post and tied the mare. She walked to the porch. She raised her hand to knock on the door frame because the door itself stood open to the morning air. "Hello," she called. The yellow dog looked at her again. "Hello," she said louder. There were boot steps on wooden floors inside, coming toward her from the back of the house, and then a man appeared in the doorway. He was not what she had imagined either. This was, perhaps, the first problem. She had imagined Caleb Harding as the kind of man who would use a marriage broker to obtain a wife. Somewhat thick in the middle, perhaps, a little self-satisfied, with the comfortable assumption of a man who owned 400 acres, and believed that ownership of land translated naturally into ownership of a claim on a woman's future. She had imagined someone easy to refuse. Instead, she was looking at a man who was maybe 30, as advertised, lean and sundark from outdoor work, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes of an exact shade of gray that reminded her of the thunderstorm on the train, that particular quality of light when you're inside looking out, and the world is doing something beautiful and dangerous at the same time. He was tall, a couple of inches over 6 feet, dressed in work clothes, a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and canvas trousers and boots worn to comfortable shapelessness, the kind of clothes that had been washed 100 times and worked in 1,000 more. He had a smear of something that might have been axle grease on his right forearm, which suggested he had been in the middle of something mechanical when she'd called. He was also, and she acknowledged this with a great deal of internal irritation, objectively very good-looking in the kind of careless, unmannered way that men who spent all their time outdoors sometimes were, without any apparent awareness of or interest in this fact. She straightened her shoulders. "I am looking for Caleb Harding," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was a low Texas drawl, unhurried but not lazy. "My name is Eleanor Voss," she said. Something moved across his face, then surprise, recognition, and something else she didn't have time to identify before it was gone. "Miss Voss," he said. "I believe," she said, keeping her voice very even, "that you have been under a misapprehension regarding my situation. I've traveled a considerable distance to clarify it in person. My aunt submitted my name to the agency without my knowledge or agreement. I did not consent to this arrangement, and I am here to tell you that directly, because I thought you deserved to hear it plainly rather than from a letter." He looked at her for a moment. Not in the way some men looked at women, assessing or dismissive, but with a focused, genuine attention that was somehow more disconcerting than either of those other things would have been. "You came all the way from Abilene to tell me that," he said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. "I did." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Would you like some coffee first?" This was not, she had to admit, what she had expected him to say. She stopped. "Coffee? You've been riding since early morning by the look of it, and you've come a long way. Coffee seems like the decent thing to offer before you," he paused. "Before anything else." Eleanor Voss had a well-developed sense of when she was being handled, and she was quite certain that what was happening here was something different. He didn't appear flustered or offended or calculating. He appeared to be a man who had been working on something mechanical in his barn, and had just discovered a woman on his porch and was offering coffee because it was the hospitable thing to do. No more than that. "Coffee would be fine," she said, before she'd entirely decided to say it. The inside of the Broken H's kitchen was clean and functional and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and old leather, with a long wooden table and 4 mismatched chairs, and a cast-iron stove that was clearly the center of the room's daily life. There were books on a shelf above the side table, more than she'd expected, and a map of Texas tacked to the wall with pins at various locations, and a coffee pot on the back of the stove that looked as though it had been keeping warm since early morning. He poured 2 cups without ceremony and set them on the table and sat down across from her, which was when Eleanor noticed that his hands were capable-looking and his nails were clean under the axle grease, and she told herself to stop noticing things about him immediately. "Caleb Harding," he said, as if introducing himself properly now that they were seated. "Eleanor Voss," she said again, unnecessarily since they had established this. "I know who you are," he said. "Margaret Goss's niece, schoolteacher. Abilene, Kansas. My aunt was thorough in her correspondence. She was." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "She also sent a photograph." Eleanor felt a jolt of pure outrage. "Sent a photograph? About 3 months ago. What photograph?" Eleanor demanded, because she had not sat for any formal portrait in the past year and was now picturing her aunt sending this man some terrible daguerreotype from her mother's parlor shelf. "It's a small one. You're with your sister and a dog on what I assume is the front porch of your house." Eleanor knew exactly which photograph. Rose had persuaded her to sit for it 2 years ago when a traveling daguerreotypist came through Abilene. Eleanor had not particularly liked the result. "That photograph was not Aunt Margaret's to send," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." Something about the way he said it, not placating, not apologetic, just honest and straightforward, caught her off guard. "You agree with me?" "I think your aunt made decisions that weren't hers to make," he said. "It's a problem when people do that." Then why did you? She started and stopped. Right back to the agency, say I was interested. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a slow, deliberate motion. Because the letter your aunt sent was the most. He paused, looking for the word. The most honest letter I'd read in a while. Not about you, particularly. About what she thought you needed, what kind of life you ought to have. It was a bossy letter written by a woman who loves her niece too much and minds her business too little, and I recognized that. And I thought. He stopped again. What? Eleanor said, and her voice came out less crisp than she'd intended. I thought I'd like to meet the woman that kind of person loves that way, he said. That's all. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. The coffee was very good, dark and strong and not bitter, the kind of coffee made by someone who made it every morning and had refined the process to a precise art. I am not going to marry you, she said, because it needed to be said again, clearly, with the door opened this wide. I know, he said. You said. You don't seem particularly troubled by that. I'm not, he said. I wasn't certain I wanted to get married. I thought maybe I should. People tell you after a while that you should, that it's time, that the house is too quiet. His jaw moved briefly. My wife died 4 years ago, fever. She was 26. Eleanor absorbed this quietly. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Thank you. He looked out the kitchen window at the yard where a ranch hand was crossing with a bucket of something. I think what I actually wanted when I wrote back to the agency was to see if. He stopped himself. If what? He met her eyes. If I was ready, he said simply. I don't know that I am. It was perhaps the most unexpectedly human thing he could have said in that moment, and Eleanor felt something she had not accounted for in any of her preparation, which was a sudden, clear-eyed recognition that this man was a real person with a real history and a real confusion about his own heart, and that she had traveled 300 miles to deliver a speech to a stranger and had arrived to find someone considerably less simple than a stranger. She stayed for coffee. Then he asked if she'd like to see the horses, and she said she would, mostly because she hadn't finished her coffee and the morning was beautiful and the refusal was already delivered, and what was the harm? And so they walked out to the corrals together, and he pointed out his particular pride. A blue roan stallion named Damascus who moved with a kind of fluid power that made Eleanor stop walking and just watch for a long moment. He's magnificent, she said. He is, Caleb agreed. There was no pride in his voice, just the same honest agreement. He's also completely unreasonable most of the time. Smart animals usually are. Do you find that? Eleanor said. That intelligence makes things difficult. He looked at her sideways. Generally, he said. Yes. She wasn't entirely sure he was still talking about the horse. She had intended to ride back to town by midday and check the train schedule for Friday. Instead, she found herself, at midday, sitting on the porch rail of the Broken H while a ranch hand named Paco, who was small and wiry, and moved with the efficiency of a man who did not waste energy under any circumstances, showed her with great seriousness a baby rabbit he had found in the barn. She found herself, at 2 in the afternoon, asking Caleb Harding questions about cattle ranching that she had not known she had any interest in, and finding his answers interesting, particularly his views on the open range and the fencing disputes that had been working through Texas for the past decade, which he had considered opinions on that were not simply financial but ethical. He believed that the range ought to be fair ground for everyone who worked it honestly, which was not a universal view among men who owned 400 acres and could afford to fence them. She found herself, at 4 in the afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table again, while he made a meal that was better than she would have predicted: pork and beans from a pot that had been going since morning, fresh cornbread, a dish of pickled okra that she had never eaten before and found surprisingly good, and listening to him describe the previous winter, which had been brutal, and the losses he'd taken, and how he decided to diversify the ranch's income by breeding and selling horses alongside the cattle operation. It's a gamble, he said. Life usually is, she said. He looked at her across the table with those gray storm eyes. "That's a schoolteacher's answer," he said. "I am a schoolteacher. You don't look like one. What do schoolteachers look like in your experience?" He considered this seriously, which she was beginning to understand was his way. He considered things seriously that a lesser man might have answered flippantly. "Mrs. Dutton used to teach school here," he said. "About 60 years old, steel-rimmed glasses, and a voice like a church bell in a metal room. She retired last year and we haven't replaced her. The children are getting their learning somewhat scattered right now." Eleanor set down her fork. "There's no schoolteacher in Dusty Creek. Not at present. They've written to the Territory School Board, but you know how that goes." Eleanor did know how that went. The frontier school situation was a patchwork of good intentions and inadequate resources, and she had read enough education reports to know that small Texas cattle towns were often at the bottom of the list when it came to formal school appointments. "How many children?" she asked. "School age, maybe 20 in the area. Could be more. There are homestead families out along the eastern creek that I don't always see in town. 20 children without a school." Eleanor filed this information away somewhere behind her intention to leave tomorrow and tried not to think about it. After supper, Caleb said it was too late for her to ride back to town safely, that the road was tricky after dark on account of the creek crossing, and she ought to stay the night. He offered her the spare room upstairs, which he called his wife's sister's room. She had stayed with them for a season after the wedding, and the room had kept her curtains and quilt, and he was matter-of-fact about it in a way that made a refusal seem unnecessarily dramatic. Eleanor accepted. Because it was too late for the road, and for no other reason. The spare room had yellow curtains and a blue quilt and a small window that looked east, toward where the first stars were appearing above the dark line of the hills. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and thought with great methodical care about what she was doing, which was, apparently, spending the night in the home of a man she had come here to reject. She had rejected him. She was still here. She lay down on top of the quilt and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night horses, the creak of the barn, a coyote somewhere in the distance, the particular silence of a place where there were no neighbors close enough to hear. And she thought about Abilene and her father's schoolroom and her mother's Bible at the bottom of her trunk in rows, who would be doing the dishes right now, and wondering what Eleanor had found when she'd arrived. She thought about the way he'd said, "I think what I actually wanted was to see if I was ready." She thought about the blue roan stallion moving like water in the morning light. She fell asleep faster than she expected to, in the yellow-curtained room in the east-facing window, with the stars coming in at the glass. In the morning, she found Caleb already up and in the kitchen when she came downstairs, and there was fresh coffee and a pan of biscuits on the stove and a jar of honey on the table, and he said good morning without any particular ceremony, as if she woke up in his spare room every day, and she sat down and had coffee and a biscuit with honey and looked out the window at the morning working its way across the yard. "I should ride back today," she said. "The train comes through Fridays," he said. "You've got time." "I have things to—" She stopped, because when she thought about it specifically, she could not think of a pressing obligation calling her back to Abilene on this particular Friday. Her father had school until summer. Rose had the house well under management. There was no current emergency requiring her presence. "I want to show you something," he said, "before you go, if you'll allow it." She looked at him. "What?" "The East Quarter," he said. "Along the creek. I want you to see what this land is." She should have said no. She said after breakfast. They rode east on two of his horses, Eleanor on a clean-legged sorrel mare, and Caleb on a big bay quarter horse that he rode with the natural ease of a man who had been doing it since childhood. The morning was already warming, the sky turning from its early pale blue to the deeper, richer color of a Texas May, and the creek quarter was, she could not find a word for it at first, and then found the only honest one. It was beautiful. The creek itself ran clear and quick over white limestone, cutting between banks that were thickly grown with sycamore and cottonwood, and a particular Texas oak she didn't know the name of, and the green along the water was the lush, intense green of a place that had found its source and made the most of it. Wildflowers she had no names for grew in the grass along the bank, blue and yellow and a deep burnt orange. And there were deer tracks in the soft earth at the water's edge, and kingfishers working the shallows. Eleanor stopped her horse without planning to and sat looking at it. "What do you think?" he said, pulling up beside her. "I think," she said carefully, "that this is one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen." He was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, my wife, she used to come here in the late afternoons. She'd bring a book and sit by the water for an hour before supper." His voice was steady when he said it, but there was a weight underneath the steadiness, the particular weight of things you have learned to carry correctly. She called it the good part of the day. Eleanor looked at him and then back at the water. "She was right," she said. They sat there for a while in a silence that was, Eleanor realized, entirely comfortable. She could not remember the last time she had sat in comfortable silence with someone she had known for barely 2 days. But there it was, the silence settling around them like the morning air itself, requiring nothing. On the ride back, she asked him about the fencing disputes she'd read about in the Kansas papers, the barbed wire wars that had been cutting up the open range. In 1882, the situation in Texas was still explosive in places. Ranchers and homesteaders and open-range cattlemen at odds over land that the law hadn't entirely decided how to manage, and she knew from what he'd said the day before that he had opinions about it. He did. He talked about it with a kind of careful consideration that was neither purely self-interested nor naively idealistic, acknowledging what the fencing meant for him economically, but also what it meant for the smaller operations trying to run cattle on land they didn't fully own. He talked about a family named Martinez who ran 60 head on a section east of the creek that backed up against his own property, and how he'd worked out a water-sharing arrangement with them when the drought had come through the previous summer, because the creek ran through his land, and it seemed plainly wrong to cut off their access to it when they needed it. "Some of the bigger ranchers don't see it that way," he said. "I've read that," Eleanor said. "The land politics out here are ugly a lot of the time," he said. "Yes." She looked at the road ahead, at the way the morning light laid long shadows from the cedar trees across the red dirt. "Were you here for the range wars in the 70s? I was. I came to this land in 1874. I was 22. I'd been working for a larger operation in West Texas, and I had enough saved to put together a down payment on this section. The range was open then, and people thought it was going to stay open." He paused. "Things change." "They do," Eleanor said. "What made you come to Texas? Originally, I mean." He glanced at her. "You're asking a lot of questions." "You showed me something beautiful on purpose," she said. "That generally means you want to be asked questions." Something moved in his expression, almost a smile, not quite. The almost of it was somehow more interesting than the thing itself would have been. "I came from Georgia," he said. "After the war, my family, there wasn't much left after the war. I was 14 when it ended. By the time I was old enough to figure out what I wanted, Georgia wasn't it anymore." Eleanor heard what was underneath that and didn't press it. The war had been 15 years ago, and it had broken things that 15 years had not entirely put back together. "You were a child," she said, "when it happened." "I was," he said, "but children see everything." Friday came and went. Eleanor did not take the Friday train. She told herself this was because she had stopped at the schoolhouse, the little stone building on the edge of town that was currently being used for storage, and spoken to the man who served as town council president, a practical, barrel-chested man named Gerald Hooper, who ran the general store and clearly felt the absence of a school as a real problem. He had explained the situation with the school board and the search for a teacher, and Eleanor had listened, and then she had said that she had a teaching certificate from the Abilene school district and 3 years of experience. And Gerald Hooper had looked at her with an expression of such relieved hope that she had found it very difficult to say she was only passing through. She had not said she was taking the position. She had said she would think about it. She sent her father a letter that afternoon, explaining the situation, all of it, including the school, and then she walked back to the boarding house and stood at her window looking at the tomato plants in the back garden and tried to have a rational internal discussion with herself about what she was doing. She was not staying because of Caleb Harding. She was very firm about this. She was considering staying because there were 20 children in this town who needed a school teacher, and she was a school teacher, and those were simply the facts of the situation. The fact that she had thought about Caleb Harding rather often over the past 2 days, that she kept returning to certain things he had said and certain ways he had looked at her, and particularly the easy, wordless comfort of sitting beside him at that creek. These were completely separate facts that had nothing to do with anything. She went to supper that Friday night at the boarding house and found him there. He was at the table when she came in, apparently an occasional guest of Mrs. Purdue's on his Fridays in town. He looked up when she came in and the almost smile was there again for a moment before he pulled it back. "Miss Voss," he said, "you didn't take the train." "I did not," she said, and sat down across from him. Mrs. Purdue served a good venison stew that night and biscuits and a dried apple cobbler that was sweet enough to be worth the wait. The other guests were different from the ones earlier in the week, 2 cowboys passing through who ate with the focused efficiency of men who ate where they could when they could, and a traveling minister named Brother Elias who had opinions about everything and delivered them in the patient, practiced voice of a man who had learned to make any dinner table into a congregation. Eleanor was naturally polite to Brother Elias while being simultaneously very glad she was not one of his parishioners. After supper, she and Caleb ended up on the boarding house porch in the warm Friday evening, not by any particular planning, but because she had gone out for air and he had followed a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee from Mrs. Purdue's kitchen, and he held one out to her without asking if she wanted it, because he'd apparently noticed over the past 2 days that she generally did. She took it. They stood at the porch railing, looking at the main street of Dusty Creek in the evening light. The saloon was doing its Friday business, voices and lights spilling out the door. Someone was playing a fiddle somewhere down the street. 2 older men sat on a bench outside the general store the way older men did in small towns the world over, observing the street with calm authority. "You spoke to Gerald Hooper today," Caleb said. "It wasn't a question." "How do you know that?" "Dusty Creek is a small town," he said. "He told you." "Mrs. Alcott told Mrs. Purdue, who mentioned it to me when I came in." He drank his coffee. "You're thinking about the school." "I'm thinking about many things," Eleanor said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something." She turned to look at him. "Why did you really come in person?" he said. "To refuse. You could have written a letter. People send letters every day. You didn't have to ride 300 miles for that." She considered giving him her rehearsed answer, the one about dignity and self-determination and not wanting to be arranged like furniture. It was a true answer as far as it went, but it didn't go all the way. "Because I was afraid," she said, and heard herself say it with some surprise. "If I had written a letter, the thing would have been done and I would never have known." She stopped. "Would never have known what?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Whether I had missed something," she said. "That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. The fiddle music drifted up the street. The 2 old men on their bench had gone inside. The stars were coming out over the Texas hills in the particular profligate way they did out here, where there was no city light to compete with them. "I want to ask you one thing," he said, "and I need you to give me an honest answer." "I generally give honest answers," she said. "I know. It's one of the things." He stopped, then started again. "You came here to refuse me. You did that, and I'm not arguing with it, and I meant what I said about the arrangement not being yours to agree to. But I want to ask you this one thing." He put his coffee cup on the rail and turned to face her fully. "If none of this existed, the agency, your aunt, the letter, the arrangement, if you had just come to Dusty Creek some other way, and we had met the same way we've been meeting these past few days, would you have wanted to know me?" Eleanor Voss stood in the warm Texas evening and looked at Caleb Harding and felt the question settle into her like the last piece of a puzzle you've been working on so long you'd almost forgotten what the picture was supposed to be. She stayed. Not because the question was a trick or a manipulation or a clever piece of persuasion. It was none of those things. It was simply the most honest question anyone had asked her in a long time, cutting through every complicated layer of circumstance and obligation, and Aunt Margaret's interference to the clean, simple thing underneath. Would she have wanted to know him? She already knew the answer. She had known it since the creek. "Yes," she said, "I would." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded once in that steady way of his that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of strong feeling, the way he held still when things mattered. "Then let's start from there," he said. She almost laughed. It was not a romantic declaration in any traditional sense. It was not poetry. It was Caleb Harding, a 30-year-old Texas rancher with a ranch named after a broken horseshoe and grease on his arm, and a blue roan stallion he described as completely unreasonable, offering her the exact thing she had not known she was looking for, which was a beginning she had chosen herself. "Let's start from there," she agreed. She wrote to her father that weekend, a longer letter this time, explaining the school and the town and the teaching position, and carefully, with much less detail than she'd used for the school, the fact that she was not leaving quite yet for other reasons as well. She wrote to Rose, who would understand better than their father and who could be trusted to manage their father's understanding in the right direction. She wrote, with considerably more careful phrasing, a letter to Aunt Margaret, which thanked her for her good intentions while making very clear, for the last time, that her intentions were no longer required. She did not write to the agency, because Caleb had already handled that. She accepted the teaching position at the Dusty Creek School on Monday morning, in Gerald Hooper's general store, over a counter of dry goods, and a handshake that was worth more in a small Texas cattle town than any contract. The pay was modest but included a rent allowance that would reduce what she owed Mrs. Perdue to something manageable, and the school would open in the fall when the children weren't needed as much for the harvest work. She had until September. It was May. What followed was a summer that Eleanor would spend the rest of her life returning to in memory, not as a lost thing but as a found one, the summer when she understood what it was to be somewhere she had chosen. She and Caleb saw each other often, though carefully, and with the measured propriety that a small town required from two unmarried people whose situation was still being assessed by its residents. Friday suppers at Mrs. Perdue's became a reliable thing. Saturdays sometimes found her at the Broken H for reasons of the horse variety. She was, in her own estimation, a good rider, and he had good horses, and the logic of this was self-evident. She helped him once with a batch of record-keeping for the ranch accounts, because he mentioned offhandedly that he found it tedious, and she had been keeping school accounts for 3 years and found it, conversely, completely straightforward. She sat at his kitchen table for an afternoon, and sorted his records and organized his ledger, and explained the system she was using while he sat across from her paying the kind of attention that had nothing to do with accounting. She noticed. She filed it away. He was not a man who rushed things. She was not a woman who could be rushed. These qualities were, in the event, well matched. He told her about Sarah once, on an evening in late June when they were riding back from the creek quarter, and the sun was going down in bands of red and orange that made the scrub look like the edge of something on fire. He talked about how they'd met. She'd been the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a practical, cheerful girl who had loved the land as much as he did, and how the fever had come out of nowhere one autumn and been over in 10 days, the brutal, indifferent speed of it, and how for the year afterward he had run the ranch on a kind of mechanical wool that had nothing underneath it. "She would have liked you," he said finally. Eleanor looked at the sunset. "What makes you say that?" "She had no patience for nonsense," he said. "She would have liked someone else who didn't." Eleanor understood that this was a gift he was giving her, this information, this past, and she received it with the care it deserved. She told him about her mother in return, not the death but the life of her, a woman who had been considerably more practical and decisive than her husband, and had run the Voss household with efficient warmth, who had taught Eleanor to read with a seriousness that suggested reading was the most important skill a person could have, which Eleanor had believed ever since. "She sounded like she was remarkable," he said. "She was," Eleanor said. "I think I have been trying to be her for 3 years in the way you try to be someone you love when they're gone because it's the closest you can get to them, but I'm not quite her." "No," he said. "You're you." She looked at him. The last of the sun was behind the hills and the sky was deepening, the first stars appearing over the east. "You say things sometimes," she said, "that go very straight to the center of things." "Seems more efficient," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It's also," she decided to say it. "It's rather disarming." He turned to look at her, and this time the almost smile became the actual thing, and it was worse better than she'd anticipated. It was the smile of a man who didn't smile often enough, which meant when he did it carried the full weight of what he found genuinely worth smiling at. "Good," he said. By July, the other residents of Dusty Creek had drawn their own conclusions about the situation between the schoolteacher from Abilene and the rancher at the Broken H, and these conclusions were, on the whole, warmly approving. Mrs. Perdue said nothing directly, but set an extra piece of cobbler on Eleanor's plate on Friday nights with a kind of meaningful efficiency. Gerald Hooper told Caleb, apparently without any awareness that this was unusual, that Miss Voss was a fine addition to the town. Paco, who was Caleb's most senior ranch hand and had been on the Broken H since 1876, said nothing at all to Eleanor, but the first time she visited the ranch after a 2-week absence on account of a summer flu, brought out a chair from the bunkhouse and set it in the shade of the barn wall without being asked, because he'd observed she preferred to sit in the shade. She appreciated Paco enormously. The Martinez family, whose 60 head used the creek water she'd heard about, sent a basket of food to the boarding house for her when she had the flu, which she hadn't expected, and which moved her considerably. Elena Martinez was a woman of about her own age, sharp-eyed and capable, who came into town on market days and who became, over the summer, something approaching a friend, the kind of friendship that forms between two capable women who recognize each other, across all the differences of circumstance and background, as the same particular kind of person. In August, a situation arose that Caleb handled in a way that she carried with her afterward for a long time. A man from a larger operation to the north, one of the big cattle syndicates that had been buying up land throughout West Texas, sent a representative to Dusty Creek to discuss, as the representative put it, consolidating water rights along the creek system. What this meant, when stripped of its official language, was that they wanted to acquire the Broken H's creek frontage, and with it, the water access that the Martinez family and 2 other smaller operations depended on. The representative came to the Broken H on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor happened to be there, on the porch, working through a set of school curriculum materials she'd sent away for. She heard the conversation that Caleb had with the representative through the open parlor window, and she did not move away from it. Caleb listened to the entire proposition with the same steady, focused attention he brought to everything. Then he declined it. He declined it politely, specifically and completely, and when the representative pushed, suggesting financial figures that Eleanor could see from the porch were genuinely substantial, Caleb said, with a calm so complete it was slightly dangerous, that the water rights were not his to sell in isolation from the people who depended on them, and that the Broken H was not a piece of a larger operation and was not going to become one, and he wished the syndicate the best in their endeavors elsewhere. The representative left. Caleb came back out onto the porch. He sat down in the rocking chair and looked at the yard for a moment. "You heard all of that," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," Eleanor said. "Any objections?" She looked at him. "Why would I have objections? That was a significant amount of money they were offering." "Yes," she said, "it was." She looked back down at her curriculum materials. "You made the right choice." He was quiet for a moment. "The Martinez family's cattle," he said. "Without that creek water, they'd be finished in a drought year." "I know," Eleanor said. "You know, that's why you said no." "Some people would say that's not my concern." "Some people are wrong," Eleanor said simply and turned a page. She heard him exhale a very quiet sound. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "I need to ask you something," he said. He was looking at her with a directness that she had learned by August to recognize as the particular directness he used when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. "Ask it," she said. "What are you planning to do after the school year?" he said. "Next June, when the year's done." She put down her papers. "I haven't decided," she said carefully. "I would like you to consider staying," he said. "Not for the school necessarily, although the school needs you and that's true." But he stopped himself. He was sitting forward in the rocking chair now, his forearms on his knees, and he was looking at her with an expression that was open in a way that she understood cost him something. "I would like you to consider staying because I am another stop. Because the days when you're here are better days," he said. "And I know that's not a declaration in any formal sense, and I'm not asking you for an answer right now, but I wanted you to know it." Eleanor sat with the warm August air around her and looked at Caleb Harding and felt her heart do something it had been building toward since the Thursday morning. She'd ridden up his lane with a rehearsed speech and good intentions. "I'm already considering it," she said. His expression shifted carefully into something she could only describe as relief that was too deep to be about anything small. She did stay. The school opened in September with 19 children. The 20th was down with a summer cough and arrived the second week. And it was everything she had hoped and more difficult and more rewarding than any previous teaching experience she'd had. Because these were children of cattle people and homesteaders, children who had been working since they could walk, and who came to school with the particular combination of practical knowledge and formal ignorance that made for the most interesting students. They knew how to read weather and track animals and calculate the value of cattle at market, and they didn't know how to write a sentence with a verb in it, and she loved them fiercely from the first week. Caleb came into town for supplies one Thursday in October and found her in the schoolroom after hours, by lamplight, correcting papers with a red pencil and a cup of cold coffee beside her, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before she heard him. "How long have you been standing there?" she demanded. "Not long," he said, in a voice that suggested it had been somewhat longer than not long. He looked around the room, the maps she'd put on the walls, the reading primers stacked on the shelves, the children's early attempts at cursive pinned above the chalkboard. "You've done something with this place. It's a good room," she said. "It just needed some attention." "Most good things do," he said. She set down her red pencil and looked at him directly. "Caleb, Eleanor, stop standing in doorways and come in," she said. He came in. He sat on the corner of the teacher's desk, which was the only adult-sized surface in the room, and looked at the papers she'd been correcting. "Which one is Mrs. Martinez's boy?" he asked. "That one." She pointed to a paper near the top of the stack. "He writes better than anyone in the class. He wants to be a lawyer." "Good for him," Caleb said, with the same straightforward sincerity he applied to everything. They sat together in the lamplight of the schoolroom, him on the corner of the desk and her in the teacher's chair, the warm oil light making the room feel smaller and quieter than the autumn night outside. It was the kind of moment that didn't announce itself, just settled over you, and Eleanor was aware of it even as she was in it, aware that it was one of those ordinary moments that you understood, even in the moment, you were going to remember. "I had a letter from my father," she said after a while. "Good news. He's thinking of retiring from the school in Abilene. He says his knee is troubling him and he's ready for a quieter life." She paused. "He says Rose is keeping company with a man who works at the bank." "Rose is your younger sister?" "Yes, she's 20. Eleanor smiled a little. "She says he's perfectly nice and father is perfectly impossible about it." "How does a bank clerk make a man impossible?" "By not being a teacher or a minister, apparently." "My father has very specific ideas about what constitutes a respectable profession." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know yet," he said. "About me." Eleanor looked at him. "He knows there's a teaching position," she said carefully. "He knows the town is good. He's been thoughtful about the rest." "Would he object?" Caleb said. There was nothing defensive in the question, just honest inquiry. "He would want to meet you," she said. "He would worry. He worries about everything as a matter of course." But no, she considered. No, he would not object, not once he met you. "Maybe he should meet me," Caleb said. Eleanor was still for a moment. Then she said, "Is there something you'd like to say clearly, Caleb?" He turned to face her fully. In the lamplight he looked very real and very present, the gray eyes steady, and the lines of his face familiar to her now in the way that only comes from months of honest looking. "I love you," he said. "That's clear." It was. It was so clear and so simply delivered that Eleanor felt it land in her chest like a hand placed directly over her heart. "I know," she said. She stopped because she wanted to say it correctly, and saying it correctly meant saying it entirely. "I love you too. I have for some time. I was being careful about it." "You're always careful," he said. "It's a fault," she admitted. "It's not," he said. "It's one of the things." He reached over and covered her hand with his, warm and steady. "It's one of the things I love. You think before you say things. I trust what you say because of it." Eleanor turned her hand over beneath his and held it. The lamplight wavered slightly in a draft from the window, and outside the Texas night was full of cricket sound and the distant complaint of cattle settling in for the cold and the immense, indifferent beauty of the autumn sky. "Ask me the question," she said quietly. He knew which question she meant. They both did. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because your aunt arranged it, not because the agency matched us, because you want to." "Because I want to," she said. "Yes." They were married in the Dusty Creek Church on a Saturday in December, just before Christmas, in a ceremony presided over by the same brother Elias who had held forth at the boarding house table on her first Friday in town. Eleanor wore her good wool dress, which she had let out at the seams slightly, and added a collar of white lace that Mrs. Perdue had gifted her from her own sewing box, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because it was December and fresh ones were not available. But Paco had pressed them from the summer and kept them in his bunkhouse and produced them that morning without any explanation of how he'd known to. And they were the exact blue and yellow and burnt orange of the Creek Quarter in May. Her father came from Abilene for the wedding. He arrived on the Thursday train looking somewhat diminished by the journey but considerably heartened by his first sight of the town, which was not what he'd feared, and by his first conversation with Caleb, which lasted 2 hours in the parlor of the boarding house and covered, Eleanor was told afterward, the cattle industry, the state of Texas schools, the war, Georgia, and Dickens, whom they had both apparently read. Her father shook Caleb's hand when it was over and said, "Take care of my daughter," in the tone of a man who had already concluded this was going to happen whether he said so or not. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. Rose could not come. The journey was too far for the winter, and she was in the early stages of a courtship that Eleanor approved of from the letters she'd received. But she sent a letter full of her particular warmth, and the information that she had cried reading about the Creek Quarter and the Blue Roan stallion, and intended to visit the following spring. Elena Martinez and her husband came to the wedding. Gerald Hooper came. Erasmo from the livery came and stood near the back and clapped with great enthusiasm. Mrs. Perdue came and did not cry, or if she did it in a manner that was entirely invisible. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the church hall, with food brought by the women of the town and a fiddle player who was considerably more skilled than the one Eleanor had heard that first Friday evening. And Caleb asked her to dance with a formality that was slightly at odds with the fact that they had by this point been riding together and sharing meals and sitting in each other's comfortable silence for 7 months. And she laughed at him for it. And he said, entirely seriously, that some things were worth doing formally. They danced, and then they danced again, and the fiddle player played something sweet and unhurried, and Eleanor Voss, Eleanor Harding now, and she turned the name over in her mind, finding that she liked it. not because it replaced her own, but because it was new and chosen, and hers put her hand in her husband's hand, and danced in the December hall in Dusty Creek, Texas. And thought about a Tuesday morning in Abilene when a letter had arrived that she had folded as small as she could and pressed to the bottom of a trunk. She had not known, that Tuesday morning, that she was about to go find something she hadn't known she was missing. She thought now that this was perhaps the best way to find things. They moved her belongings from Mrs. Purdue's to the Broken H on a clear cold Sunday, which was not a great quantity of belongings. A trunk, a box of books, the school papers she'd already brought back and forth so often that the ranch kitchen had become as natural a place to work on them as the boarding house room. She stood in the room with the yellow curtains and the blue quilt and the east-facing window that had been her room since that first Thursday night, and she thought about the first time she'd slept here, lying on top of the quilt in her traveling clothes, telling herself she would be on the train the following day. She hung her winter coat on the hook behind the door and set her mother's Bible on the bedside table, and when Caleb appeared in the doorway she looked at him standing there in the good gray morning light of December and felt the full weight of what it was to have chosen exactly where you were. "This is my room," she said. "Our room," he corrected mildly. "Our room," she agreed. "It needs another bookshelf." He looked at the wall where she'd stacked 3 volumes on the floor already. "I'll build one," he said. "You'll build one." "I built the porch," he said. "I can build a bookshelf." "You built the porch," she repeated, looking at him. "Is there anything you can't do?" "Accounting," he said. "Lucky you married a schoolteacher then." "It was," he said, "my primary consideration." She threw a pillow at him. He caught it. The yellow morning light came in at the east window, and the kitchen smell of coffee drifted up from below and outside Damascus. The blue roan was making himself known to the morning in his particular voluble way, and this was, Eleanor thought, this is it. This ordinary, beautiful, specific morning in December in Texas. This is what it feels like. Winter on the ranch was its own education. Eleanor had known Texas summers, which were the thing everyone talked about, but the Texas winter of 1882 to 1883 was a revelation of different quality, not as brutal as the Kansas winters she'd grown up with, but with its own particular demands, the cold coming in from the north in waves, the need to keep the cattle moving, the livestock care that Caleb managed with the same focused competence he brought to everything. She learned more about ranching in those winter months than she'd absorbed in the entire summer, because winter was when the work could not afford to be theoretical. She also, in those winter months, learned Caleb in the way you learn someone when you share a life, and not just a collection of afternoons. She learned that he was a very early riser, and that he was at his quietest in the first hour of the morning, which she respected and adapted to by becoming an early riser herself, which had never been her natural inclination but became one. She learned that he had a systematic approach to worry. He identified what could be controlled and controlled it, and set aside what couldn't with a discipline that she occasionally found maddening but more often found steadying. She learned that he read history the way she read novels, with full absorption and the willingness to lose track of time, and that he had opinions about the Texas history books in particular that he delivered with a precision she found thoroughly entertaining. She learned that he kept the pressed wildflowers in a small frame he'd made himself, and that they were on the wall of their bedroom behind the bedroom door where visitors wouldn't see it, but where you could see it from the bed, if you happened to be looking. She found the frame on a morning in January and stood looking at it for a long moment. When she came down to breakfast and looked at him across the table, he looked back with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. "You had those pressed already," she said. "In October." "Paco did," he said with great attention to the distinction. "You told Paco to," she said. "I might have mentioned it." "When?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "May." "May," she repeated. "As in May, the month you met me." "It was a beautiful place," he said. "The flowers were part of it." Eleanor looked at him across the breakfast table. "You are a great deal more romantic than you present yourself as," she said. "I present myself accurately," he said. "I just don't present everything at once." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from being thoroughly known and thoroughly surprised at the same moment, and he watched her laugh with a look on his face that she had learned, by January, to recognize as his particular form of happiness, quiet and complete and worth the world. Spring came to Dusty Creek with the particular exuberance of a Texas spring, which is to say it came extravagantly, the country going from the muted colors of winter to something that seemed almost implausibly vivid, like a painter who had been told to show restraint and had ignored the advice. The Creek Quarter in May of 1883 was every bit as beautiful as it had been in May of 1882, which was the anniversary of her arrival at the Broken H, and they rode out there on the morning of that anniversary and sat by the water on the flat limestone shelf that had become their particular spot, and she told him she was expecting a child. He was still for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and pulled her against his side, and she felt the deep, slow breath he took, the kind of breath that means something large is moving through you. "When?" he said. "November," she said, "or December. The doctor in town thinks December." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said in a voice that was very careful and very full, "Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Strong constitution as advertised." She felt his laugh more than heard it, a vibration in his chest against her shoulder. Then he pressed his face into her hair briefly, a gesture so entirely unlike his usual restraint that she felt it all the way through her. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." They sat by the creek in the May sun and let the year go around them. Rose came that spring as promised, arriving on the May train from Abilene looking considerably more polished than Eleanor remembered. She had, it emerged, been engaged since February to the perfectly nice bank clerk, whose name was Henry and who Rose described with the luminous, slightly dazed quality of someone who has recently understood what all the fuss about love is for. Eleanor liked him immediately based on the letters and told Rose so, and Rose sat at the Broken H kitchen table for an afternoon drinking coffee and looking around the house with the expression of someone trying to match the place to the stories she'd been told. "You're happy," Rose said with a kind of awe that she made no attempt to conceal. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Genuinely happy," Rose said. "Not managing happy or being responsible for everyone happy, actually happy." "Yes," Eleanor said again. Rose looked out the kitchen window at the yard where Caleb was talking to Paco about something near the barn. She stopped. "He is," Eleanor agreed. "That's all I'm saying. That's all you needed to say." Rose stayed for 2 weeks and departed back to Abilene with a full heart and an agreement to return for Christmas. Eleanor's father sent letters regularly and had recovered, after extensive correspondence with his new son-in-law on the subjects of Texas ranching, Dickens, and the state of Kansas education policy, to the point of considering a visit in the fall. The school year ended in June with a ceremony at the church hall, Eleanor's idea, her first year, and it went well enough that she intended to make it an annual event. 19 of the 20 students had improved their reading to measurably higher levels. The 20th, young Marcus O'Brien, who had started the year functionally unable to read, could now read the first book of primers through without stopping. This was, in Eleanor's professional opinion, the best thing she had done in her 3 years of teaching, and she was not modest about it in her own private assessment. After the ceremony, the Martinez boy, whose name was Alejandro, and who was 12 years old and whose determination to become a lawyer Eleanor intended to support in every way available to her, presented her with a small card he had written himself in his exceptional penmanship that said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harding, for believing we could." She kept it. She still had it decades later. Caleb had been working on an addition to the house since spring, a proper study for her, a room with a large south window and built-in shelves along 2 walls and a good wide desk, because the kitchen table had served well enough, but there was a child coming, and things were going to need to be organized differently. He finished it in July, the study and the bookshelf he'd promised her in December, and she spent a Saturday afternoon arranging her books on the shelves with the serious pleasure of someone performing a meaningful ritual. He leaned in the doorway and watched her organize her books for about 20 minutes before she noticed him. "You're doing it again," she said. "Standing in doorways. You remember that." "I remember everything," he said, in the tone that was not quite the almost smile but was its close relative. "Come in, then," she said. He came in and looked at the books she'd arranged and pulled one off the shelf she had organized by subject, which he examined with the air of a man evaluating a system he was about to have opinions on, and turned it in his hands. It was a history of the Texas Republic, the period before statehood, which he had apparently read already because he opened it to a page near the middle with the recognition of someone finding a familiar passage. "How many books do you own?" he said. "With the ones you ordered from the Fort Worth catalog for my birthday," she counted briefly. 47. 47, he repeated. He put the Texas history back on the shelf. "We're going to need more shelves." "We're going to need a library," she said. "One step at a time," he said, which was his general philosophy and which she had found in the year of knowing him to be a very reliable one. The child arrived in November. Not December. The baby made his own schedule, which Eleanor later observed was thoroughly in character. It was a boy, born on a cold, clear night in November 1883, with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubbornness visible, the doctor said, from about the first 5 minutes. They named him James Thomas Harding James for Caleb's father and Thomas for Eleanor's grandfather, and he arrived into the world with a fully operational pair of lungs and a focused, intense gaze that made Eleanor, from the first time she looked at him properly, think of the way Caleb looked at things he was trying to understand. Caleb held his son for the first time in the gray dawn of that November morning, sitting in the chair by the east window while Eleanor slept, and she didn't sleep after all but watched him from beneath her eyelashes, too tired to speak but too much herself to miss the thing in front of her. She watched him hold this small new person with the same careful, steady attention he brought to everything that mattered, and she thought that this was what she had come 300 miles to refuse and had found instead. Not the arrangement, not the agency's match, but this man with his honest gray eyes and his Creek-Quarter beauty, and his certainty that some things were worth doing formally, and some things did not need to be said until they could be said completely. She had asked herself on the train south through the Oklahoma Territory what she was doing. She knew the answer now. Rose and Henry married in March of 1884 in Abilene, and Eleanor made the trip north with James, who was 4 months old and already extremely interested in everything, propped on her hip during the ceremony like a small editorial presence. Rose was radiant and Henry was pleasantly overwhelmed, and Eleanor's father danced at the reception for the first time in years, and Caleb stood beside her during the dancing and held James and danced very minimally, but genuinely, when Eleanor insisted, and she kept the image of it close afterward. Eleanor's father retired from teaching in Abilene that summer and came to spend the winter at the Broken H, which had been offered and accepted over a long series of letters and counterproposals that were, Eleanor privately felt, a fairly accurate representation of both men's characters. He arrived in October and spent his first week quietly observing everything with the meticulous attention of a schoolteacher, and then began, with Caleb's permission and the approval of Damascus, to take daily rides on the easier of the Broken H horses, which was something he had always wanted to do and had never in his Abilene life had the opportunity for. He and Caleb played chess in the evenings. Eleanor had not known Caleb played chess until her father brought the set out of his trunk, and Caleb sat down across from him with the expression of a man who had been looking for this exact challenge. They were, it emerged, extremely well matched, and the games were long and mostly silent, broken only by the fire and James's various observations from his blanket on the floor. "I like him," her father told Eleanor one morning when Caleb had ridden out early. "I didn't expect to like him quite so much." "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked. "Honestly," he considered. "I expected a rougher article. He's precise, he thinks." "He does," Eleanor agreed. "He's right for you," her father said, with the simple finality of a man who had arrived at a conclusion after thorough examination of the evidence. "I didn't see it from Abilene, but I see it here." "Took you a while," Eleanor said. "I'm a careful man," he said. "You get it from me." She kissed his cheek, which made him color slightly, as it always had. The second year at the school brought 23 students, a number that tested the building's capacity and eventually convinced the town council to discuss an expansion. Alejandro Martinez continued to be the best student Eleanor had ever taught, a fact she communicated to his mother, who received it with the exact quiet pride of someone who had always known it but was grateful to have it confirmed. 3 new Homestead families had settled east of the creek, and their children made up the new numbers. Eleanor organized a book lending arrangement with the general store for families who couldn't afford primers, and Gerald Hooper absorbed the cost without complaint, which was how she knew, if she had needed confirmation, that Dusty Creek was a good town. In 1885, in the spring, the Broken H had its best cattle year since Caleb had bought the property. The combination of the horse breeding operation and the cattle had stabilized the ranch's income through the drought years, and the water-sharing arrangement with the Martinez family had been formalized into a legal agreement that Caleb had a Fort Worth lawyer draft properly, because he believed things worth doing were worth doing permanently. He expanded the east pasture that year and hired 2 more hands, one of whom was Alejandro Martinez's older brother Daniel, who was 18 and strong and learned everything about ranching with the same focused quickness his brother applied to school books. Eleanor was expecting again that spring, a fact she announced over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the same directness she'd brought to most things in their marriage. Caleb put his coffee cup down very carefully on the table and looked at her. "November again," he said. "October, the doctor thinks." "October," he said. He picked up his coffee cup again, wrapped his hands around it. "James will be 2. He will be a handful already," Eleanor said. "This will make him slightly more of one." Caleb was smiling now, the full real thing. "Are you well?" "Perfectly well. Strong constitution, I know," he said. "I know." The baby was born in October as predicted. A girl this time, with Eleanor's auburn hair and Caleb's gray eyes, and James's professional assessment offered from the doorway, an unacceptably loud voice. They named her Clara Margaret Clara because they both liked it and it was simple and strong, and Margaret after Eleanor's aunt, which Caleb raised his eyebrows at, and Eleanor said, with the equanimity of someone who had made her peace with something, that her aunt had been wrong about how she'd done it but not wrong about why. "She loves you," he said. "Extravagantly and without boundaries," Eleanor agreed. "But yes." Aunt Margaret received the news of her great-niece's name in a letter that made her, by Rose's account, cry for 20 minutes and then bake 3 loaves of bread, which was her particular response to strong emotion. The years that came after were full in the way that good years are, not full of dramatic events but full of substance, of the particular texture of a life being lived at full occupancy. The school grew. By 1887, there were 31 students and a second teacher, a young woman from San Antonio named Miss Calloway, who arrived in September with 2 trunks and a no-nonsense attitude, and who became, within the first month, exactly the kind of colleague Eleanor had hoped for. Alejandro Martinez left Dusty Creek in 1888 for Austin to begin studying law, sponsored by a small fund that Eleanor had organized from the town council and several of the local ranchers, including Caleb, who had signed the first contribution without being asked twice. James was 5 when his sister Clara was born, and the two of them grew up on the Broken H with the particular combination of freedom and responsibility that ranch life produced, knowing how to ride before they were 6, knowing the names of every plant along the creek by the time they were 8, accompanying their father on morning rounds in the summers, with the focused interest of children being taught things that mattered. Clara had her father's systematic approach and James had his mother's way with words, and together they constituted exactly the kind of chaos and joy that Eleanor had not, on the Tuesday morning in Abilene when she had read her aunt's letter, allowed herself to anticipate. Caleb in those years was everything he had been at the beginning and more, because the thing about learning a person deeply is that you find more of them as you go, not less. She found in the years of the marriage that he had a dry wit he deployed rarely but devastatingly. She found that he sang, very quietly and not particularly well, when he was working alone in the barn. She found that he was teaching himself Spanish from a primer he'd gotten from Erasmo's wife, because he wanted to be able to speak directly with the Martinez family in their own language, and that his progress was slow but his determination was absolute. She found that he grieved things privately and processed grief by work, the same way he'd done in the year after Sarah's death, and that the way to reach him in those times was not words but presence, which she became skilled at providing. She found that he kept, in the breast pocket of his good jacket, the small square of her aunt's letter, not the whole letter. Just the part where Margaret had described Eleanor. She is the kind of woman who makes any place better by being in it, and I know you will see it immediately. He had cut it out of the letter with a pocket knife neatly and kept it. She found this on a winter evening when she was brushing his jacket before a church social, found it in the pocket as a small, dense square of paper, and opened it with careful fingers and read it, and stood in the upstairs bedroom with the last of the winter light coming in the east window, and felt something go through her that was so large and so warm she had to sit down on the bed for a moment. She put it back exactly as she had found it and never told him she'd found it, because some things are better as known secrets. The ranch changed over the years as the land around it changed. The fence wars that had threatened to reshape Texas settled into a new reality by the late 1880s, with property lines formalized, and the range divided in ways that were not always just but were at least stable. Caleb maintained the water agreement with the Martinez family and 2 others through the legal framework he'd established, and when there were disputes along the creek boundary, and there were, 3 times over the decade, he managed them with the same firm, fair steadiness that he managed everything, which earned him a reputation in the county as a man whose word was reliable and whose limits were real. He was elected to the county commissioners' panel in 1890, which he accepted with visible reluctance and then approached with complete seriousness, because that was his way. He served 2 terms and used them to advocate for the smaller ranchers and homestead families that the larger operations tended to overlook, and for the school funding that Eleanor reminded him about with some regularity. He did not seek a 3rd term, because he had, he said, done what he could do there, and there were other things that needed his attention. The other things included, that year, the expansion of the house. James was 9 and Clara was 7, and there was a 3rd child on the way, another girl, born in the summer of 1891, and named Sarah Me. Sarah for the woman who had loved the Creek Quarter and who deserved to be remembered in a house that had found its way back to being a family, and Me for no particular reason except that Caleb said it went well with Sarah and Eleanor agreed. Sarah Me arrived with her mother's auburn hair and a temperament so placid and sunny that she seemed, for the first few months, like a different species from her 2 intensely focused older siblings. Where did she come from? James asked one evening, looking at his new sister with genuine puzzlement. She came from us, Eleanor said. She doesn't seem like us, James said. Give her time, Caleb said. He was right. By the time Sarah Me was 3, she had developed opinions that she communicated with considerable force, and James revised his assessment. The house by the early 1890s was a different house from the one Eleanor had ridden up to on that May morning in 1882. The addition Caleb had built for her study had been extended. The porch had been widened. The window boxes he'd installed in 1883, after she'd mentioned, the empty ones were full every spring with whatever would grow. The library, 2 rooms on the north side of the house lined with shelves, held more than 300 books, assembled over a decade of birthday and Christmas gifts, and careful catalog orders and acquisitions from traveling booksellers, and one extraordinary box sent by her father when he moved from Abilene, full of his own collection packed in careful newspaper. Her father had moved to Dusty Creek permanently in 1889, a decision made after a winter at the Broken H and a spring, and then a summer, and then a mutual acknowledgement that going back to Abilene no longer made sense. He lived in town, in a house he rented from Mrs. Purdue, who had by that point expanded the boarding house into a proper guest house, and he came to the Broken H for Sunday dinners with the regularity of a planet in orbit, and he played chess with Caleb, and read to the grandchildren and taught James and Clara how to identify the birds along the creek, which was a skill he had developed in his retirement as a way of organizing his walks into something productive. Rose and Henry came from Abilene twice a year, sometimes more, with their own children, 2 boys and a girl, all of them of the particular enthusiastic variety that indicated Henry's mild temperament and Rose's energetic intelligence had combined into something rather wonderful. The Broken H on those occasions was a controlled chaos that Eleanor presided over with the expertise of a woman who had been managing classrooms for years and found the principles transferable. In the spring of 1893, Eleanor taught her last year at the Dusty Creek School. Miss Calloway had been the head teacher for 2 years already, and there was now a third teacher, a young man named Mr. Porter who was good with the older students in mathematics and science, and who Eleanor had helped recruit from a teaching college in Austin. The school had 42 students, a proper stone building expanded from the original, and a lending library that shared the town library she'd helped establish in 1889. She did not leave education entirely. She never could have. She continued as school board president, a position she had held since 1886, and she ran a reading class for adults 1 evening a week for years, ranch hands and homesteaders' wives, and anyone else who wanted it, conducted in the schoolroom with no ceremony and no judgment, and a consistent enrollment of between 4 and 12 people. Paco attended this class in 1888 and learned, at 42, to read English with a slow and certain dignity that he brought to the task, and afterward read the cattle reports in the weekly paper each week and communicated their contents to the other hands with the authority of a man who had earned his knowledge. The century turned, and Eleanor Harding was 41 years old and the mother of 3, and the wife of a rancher who had gray at his temples now and lines at his eyes that the years had put there. And she loved him in the way that only time makes possible, with a full knowledge of who he was, and an understanding of every layer, and a love that had gone past feeling and become something structural, something the days were built on. James was 18 in 1901 and beginning to find his feet in a new century, and Clara was 16 and already possessed of the kind of clear directional intelligence that suggested she was going to go somewhere specific and do something particular with her life. And Sarah Mee was 10 and still the sunniest presence in the house, though with the opinions that had fully emerged and showed no sign of moderating. One evening in November 1901, the anniversary of James's birth, the family sat at the long kitchen table of the Broken H for his birthday supper, all of them, including Eleanor's father, who was 72 and slower but entirely present, and Rose and Henry, who had come down from Abilene for it. And Eleanor looked at the table and counted what was there. Caleb at the head, talking to Henry about the new cattle prices with the careful attention of a man who was always learning. James, who had grown into someone both of his parents recognized and were slightly in awe of. Clara, who was conducting a parallel conversation with Rose about whether she could go to study at a women's college in Austin, a conversation that Rose was winning Clara's side of quite effectively. Sarah Mee, who was explaining to Eleanor's father something about the birds she'd seen along the creek that morning with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she had inherited something from him. The firelight, the smell of the supper, the yellow curtains in the windows, the third pair since the first ones faded out. Caleb caught her eye across the table and she looked at him and he looked back, and the look said, in the way that 20 years of honest looking makes possible, everything that needed to be said. Which was this. All of this. Yes. She reached across and put her hand over his on the table, and he turned his hand over and held it in the crowded, warm room with the family talking around them. Later, after the children were in their rooms and the guests were settled and her father had been walked home to his house in town by James, who was becoming, in these things, his grandfather's careful escort, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch in the November chill with their coffee cups and the stars doing their extravagant Texas thing above the dark hills. "Good day," he said. "One of the best," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when he was about to say something he'd been holding. She knew the quality of that quiet by now the way she knew the quality of the morning light and the creek sound, and the particular way the wind moved through the cedar. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the East Quarter, the creek section. I want to deed it," he said, "formally in trust so that no one can sell the water rights ever, whether we're here or not, whether anyone else is here or not." Eleanor looked at the dark hills. "For the Martinez family. For anyone who needs it," he said. "The families along the creek, any family that comes, it ought to be permanent." She looked at him. The lamplight from the parlor window caught the side of his face, and she thought about the first morning she'd seen him, the axle grease and the gray eyes and the coffee offered before anything else. 20 years and 3 children and 47 books and 300 more, and a schoolroom full of children who could read and a ranch that had been fair and a man who had been true. "I'll write to the Fort Worth lawyer," she said. "Monday," he said. "Monday," she agreed. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the November night and listened to the land they had built something on, and the coyotes in the hills, and the particular silence of a place that had become a home so thoroughly that the silence itself felt like belonging. The deed was filed in January of 1902 with the county land office. The creek section formally placed in a permanent conservation arrangement that protected the water access for all the surrounding families. The Fort Worth lawyer said he had never drafted quite that kind of document before, and Caleb said that didn't make it wrong, and the lawyer agreed. Alejandro Martinez, by 1902, was a practicing attorney in Austin with a reputation for taking cases that needed taking. And when he heard about the creek deed, he wrote a letter to Eleanor that she read standing at the kitchen window, and then folded and put in her Bible next to her mother's handwriting. He wrote that, when he had been 12 years old and struggling to read his primers in the little stone schoolhouse in Dusty Creek, there had been a woman who had looked at him and said, without any particular drama, that he was going to need to work harder because he had a great deal ahead of him that was going to require everything he had. He had not believed her at the time, he wrote. He had come to understand that she had been exactly right. Clara did go to Austin to study. She went in the fall of 1902, 18 years old and certain of her direction in the way that Eleanor recognized from her own younger self, and was proud of past any reasonable expression of it. She would come home for summers and bring the smell of the city and the ideas of a new century with her, and Eleanor and Caleb would sit across from their daughter at the kitchen table and ask questions and listen with full attention and feel, in those conversations, the particular satisfaction of having raised someone who had grown beyond your ability to entirely follow, but whose roots you could see clearly. James stayed in Dusty Creek. He had no desire to go elsewhere, a fact that surprised Eleanor slightly and pleased Caleb deeply, though he would never have put any pressure on it. He worked the broken H through his 20s with the steady competence of someone who had grown up knowing the work. And in 1904, he married a young woman from a neighboring county named Alice Bertrand, who was 22 and practical and warm, and made the very specific kind of biscuit that James had apparently mentioned to her 17 times before she produced them for Sunday dinner, at which point Eleanor caught Caleb's eye, and they both looked away before they could laugh. Sarah Mee, at 20, was the most surprising of the three in her direction, which was music. She had been playing the piano in the church since she was 12, learning from the minister's wife, and at 20 she went to San Antonio to study formally with a teacher there, coming back to Dusty Creek every Christmas and Easter with new pieces and a growing mastery that the whole town came to church to hear. The house on the broken H in 1905 had seen a great deal and would see more, and it sat on its rise above the east pasture in the Texas afternoon light looking entirely itself. The wide porch, the faded green shutters, the window boxes full of whatever that season had to offer, the gate at the bottom of the lane with the H above it, and the horseshoe now properly nailed on both sides, because James had fixed it in 1900 as a 21st birthday gift to his father, who had looked at the repaired horseshoe for a long moment, and then thanked his son with a quiet sincerity that James said afterward was better than any speech. Eleanor was 46 that year and teaching the adult reading class twice a week by then, and serving on the school board and writing letters to the state education office about the school funding situation in rural Texas, with a persistence that the state office had come to regard with a kind of respectful wariness. She was also writing in the evenings, a document she had been working on for 2 years, a record of the Dusty Creek School from its founding to its present, including the names of every student and what she knew of them, because she believed that things worth doing were worth recording, and that the people who had sat in those schoolroom chairs deserved to be named. Caleb read every page of it as she finished them, sitting across from her in the study with the south window, which now had a second chair by the desk. He had added it in 1887 without saying why, and she had known why immediately. He read her pages with the same attention he brought to his Texas history books, and offered corrections of fact and occasional gentle suggestions about phrasing, which she accepted or declined with the equal partnership of two people who respect each other's expertise without surrendering their own. On a May morning in 1905, 23 years after Eleanor Voss had ridden up the lane of the broken H with a rehearsed speech and a determined spine, she and Caleb rode out to the East Quarter together, on 2 of the broken H's best horses bred from Damascus's line, the blue roan stallion long gone now, but his children and grandchildren filling the corral with his particular fluid beauty. They rode to the creek and tied the horses to the sycamore and sat on the flat limestone shelf that was still their particular spot, still with the kingfishers working the shallows and the wildflowers in the grass and the water going clear and quick over the white rock, and the morning light coming in low and golden over the hills. Eleanor sat with her husband's hand in hers and looked at the water and thought about a Tuesday morning, and a letter folded small, and a train going south through the Oklahoma Territory, and a woman who had not known, boarding that train, that she was going to find the best thing in her life by going to refuse it. "Do you ever think," she said, "about what would have happened if I had just written the letter?" He thought about this in the serious way he still thought about things. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think?" "I think you would have written a very good letter," he said, "and I would have received it and thought about it, and probably," he paused, "probably I would have written back to say I understood. And then I don't know," he said. "I've never been very good at knowing things I haven't done." Eleanor looked at the water. A kingfisher dropped from its branch and hit the surface and was gone in a second, a flash of blue. "I'm glad I didn't write the letter," she said. "No," he said. "I've known since the morning you got here." She looked at him. "How?" "Because you came in person," he said. "A person who just wants to say no sends a letter. A person who isn't sure yet." He stopped. A person who isn't sure yet comes herself. She thought about this. She thought about the train and the window of silver rain and the first sight of the Texas hills and the way she had told herself very firmly that she was not nervous. "I was quite sure," she said with mock dignity. "You were not," he said. "I had a very good speech." "You delivered it very clearly," he said. "And then you had coffee," she laughed. The creek ran and the wildflowers bent in the morning wind and the horses waited patiently at the sycamore, and the hills were gold and green, and the sky was the exact deep blue of a Texas May morning in a year when everything that mattered was exactly where it should be. She rested her head on his shoulder, the way she had on the November porch, the way that by now was as natural as breathing. "Good part of the day," she said. He pressed his lips briefly to her hair. "All of them," he said. "All of them are the good part." And they sat together in the morning by the water that was protected now and permanent, in the country they had made their own, in the life that had begun with a wrong assumption and a 300-mile journey and one question asked plainly in the warm Texas evening, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.